So what does it mean in a nutshell to have a marketing mindset in L&D?
So I'll just jump in first and then Mike can add to this. For me, it's about looking outside of what we're doing and learning and really take elements from marketing that they do really well, such as attention grabbing visuals, good copy, learner personas, and bring them into learning and development to create better learning experiences that have an impact.
Okay.
Have
Yeah,
it.
and I'm very similar to that. And I just say it's, treating learning like it's something valuable that people want, which it is, and it should be if it's done well, and, not just something that they have to do. And then using those techniques that marketing uses that Bianca just mentioned, attention grabbing tools that they use to sell products, but that we are helping people learn and build skills and, help the organization get the results that it's after. Great, thanks. That was really nice and succinct as a kind of intro as well. So if we went back to that elevator pitch idea, then if you had that famous 30-second window to try and pitch to L&D as to why they should take on a marketing mindset, what would you say?
Mike, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, so I think a lot of learning programs sort of miss the mark, not because the content is bad, but because, people are tuning out. So we're all bombarded with stuff all the time. But marketers understand that and they recognize what they're competing with, and they use things like stories to sort of spell out the benefits and make it personal to their audience. So those are the kind of tricks that we should borrow for learning is if you want people to learn, you have to make them care first. And that's one of the big reasons why learning teams should think like marketers.
And for me, it's that data-driven approach. Marketers are extremely good in taking data and making decisions based on that. And in L&D, we talk about it, but often we don't do it. And so I think, especially if you talk to stakeholders, it's so crucial to start there. How can we actually tie the learning and performance objectives and the outcomes of a learning experience to the overall business goals and strategic objectives? And data can definitely help with that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks. Let's take that one a little bit further then. So um, I guess you've said there that maybe L&D don't always naturally put their arms around data, right? They don't always look at that kind of impact measure, whereas in marketing teams, they always do, right? It's just part of what they do. So what would you say there is the kind of missing link? Like what could L&D be borrowing from marketing to help them focus on impact and drive impact?
Yeah, I think the first thing I want to acknowledge is that it is a little bit harder in learning and development to have that, that measure the ROI or whatever you're looking at, right? So I do want to acknowledge that it's a little bit easier in marketing because you create content and you get certain leads and those leads turn into sales and that's, a great measure. However, thinking about it this way, I think we can look at not just seat time because that doesn't tell us a lot, but really look more at that engagement piece, like how engaged are people throughout. And it's almost like a leading indicator for me, right? So if people are engaged throughout a learner journey and a learning campaign, and they meet the goals and performance objectives we set out in the beginning, I can tell in the moment, like, yes, there's a good chance we're going to meet that overall business goal. If I don't meet those leading indicators in terms of, oh, I don't see the impact throughout the learner journey, then there's a pretty good chance I can't make it. So again, it goes back to having that conversation about tying learning and performance objectives to the overall goal.
Mm.
And it's not an easy conversation, and it takes time also as L&D professionals to have that conversation and to really be fluent in talking data, right?
Yeah, and I would add to that. I think another common challenge that I see a lot is, we're really good at working super hard to create great content. But if nobody cares, it's like you had a party and forgot to invite anyone. And so we sort of have to switch gears instead of just building it and hoping people will learn. We need to grab their attention, go where they already are, and sort of show them how the learning helps them succeed. And so the problem is that the learning itself, it's getting people to see how valuable it is and then want to use it. Hmm.
Okay, great. We're going to dive into some of these points, I think, a little bit later as well. So, I mean, I guess like what learning or what L&D are trying to do and what marketing trying to do, they're both trying to motivate people to do something, right? Neither can force somebody to do something, but they're trying to motivate through different means. And L&D could argue they go further by with the educational piece to try and influence people to do something. But ultimately, that's the kind of same goal. But if you had to pinpoint the key differences, between how marketing might approach that task and how L&D might typically, what would you call out?
Well, first, I would say that that's absolutely a common goal, but even before that is getting people's attention, because if we don't have their attention, then the rest of it doesn't really matter. So I think there's boosted or a pair of things. I think what marketers are really good at, better than most learning teams, is really getting to know their audience before they start building content. Um, they also, so instead of just making training before we understand who the audience is, they get to know them really well, and we'll talk about that, how they do that in a little bit. Then they also sort of are opposite of L&D, and oftentimes we think, oh, we're going to build a course and it's the one and done mentality. Whereas marketers understand you've got to talk to people, go where they are, and it's a campaign mindset versus the one and done thinking.
Yeah, not too much to add here. We always joke marketers also have more money. So I do want to acknowledge that that helps, right? They usually have different technology. So they're really good at looking at a marketing tech stack versus learning. We often have the LMS or the LXP, and that's the holy grail. And sure, we have a couple of authoring tools, but that's kind of it. And I mean, we're getting better at looking at the environment that people are in, especially as we talk about learning in the flow of work and in the moment of need to say, okay, they are in Microsoft Teams or Slack every day. Like, how can we leverage that? But it's still kind of, slower. And yeah, marketers are just much, much better at tying in different technologies and using each technology for the benefits that that technology has, and then putting it all together into this ecosystem. But I also want to say it's not all just about technology, obviously, right? We need to create a learning experience first and then identify what technologies can elevate that experience. But yeah, I'm a big believer in, as Mike was already saying, meet the learners where they're at and really understand that. And so, yeah, that segmentation and buyer persona approach is extremely important to marketers. And yeah, we could definitely do a little bit better, go beyond that target audience analysis.
And meeting people where they're at, right? Tying it in with your thoughts there about how marketing might be more naturally multi-channel or multi-tech. It's not necessarily that they're installing new technologies, right? They're looking at where people are hanging out, whether that's like you were listing some of the places, you got Slack, you got email, but are they also on LinkedIn? Where do they talk to each other? Are there forums running? So they're pretty good at thinking about those channels that mostly, as you said, that you was kind of hinting at, most of them exist also to learning teams. It's just whether you think with that mindset, I guess, right?
Absolutely. And on the channel comment there, marketers have like controlled and non-controlled channels. So the controlled channels are the websites and, your own social media account that you kind of own. But then non-controlled channels would be like Google reviews or Yelp or something like this. And marketers are really good in tying these into their campaigns and their approaches as well. And the equivalent on our side would be kind of like crowdsourced content, right? If you think about it this way. But I know a lot of learning teams are very scared about getting input from other teams and because they can't control it, right? But it's okay because if we get better at tying in those non-controlled channels, they actually become part of the learning solution. So, let's say a learner wants to look something up, they can't find it all on the LMS. What do? They go to YouTube. Right. So why don't we tie that in and make it part of the experience? Right.
Yeah, brilliant. So you've mentioned some of these already, but just kind of pull together a kind of top level list. What strategies do you believe that L&D need to borrow from marketing?
I guess
Uh, I'll start. I'll start. So, like we've said now a couple of times, to follow up on some things that we've both said now, is the foundation is really to understand our learners. Well,
Hmm.
I would say two foundations: understand our learners, and also understand sort of how people process information. And a big thing that we often get stuck in is, oh, we're just going to give them a bunch of facts and figures and assume that people will make a logical choice. And that's really not the way that we process information. It's not the way we make decisions.
Mm.
Our subconscious thinking is really dominant and powerful influence on the way we behave and the actions that we choose. And I think marketers understand that, and they do things like tapping into emotions and how do people feel and how does this product make people feel, and that's something that's really big, that it doesn't require a big budget. It just requires a new mindset and a new perspective. And so um, in order to do those things, it ties back to understanding our learners. So what are the things that they care about? What's their day-to-day like? What are they scared of? What do they hope for? um, all of those things. And then, we're not just telling them to do stuff, they're actually helping them see the benefits of it so that they're going to want to do it, naturally.
Yeah, so it's that learner persona concept. It's learner journeys, which in my mind are much more a strategic journey to really get from A to Z, all the way. And the content strategy, like how do you actually, take care of your content? Then it's the writing and the visuals that we talked about, and the learning campaign, which is much more tactical compared to the learner journey. And then, of course, the technology and data-driven decision making. So I think that's the list.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Well, let's dive in a little bit then to talk about personas, because I think, we've already established that marketers don't get anywhere without mapping their personas for their campaigns first. So, who's this for? You know, and beyond, right? We've already talked about emotions, but let's dive into those so that maybe those who work in L&D can understand what techniques might be used and also what sort of things you're trying to capture when you create personas in marketing that L&D could learn from.
Yeah, most important of all is they need to be research based. So sure, you can make assumptions, but that doesn't really help you a lot. So when I say research based, you really want to talk to your learners, your end users, because they will tell you exactly what they need and what they're looking for. And when I do interviews, I usually do about 10 to 15 interviews per persona, roughly. And I have more generic questions actually. So I don't ask about training specifically. It's more like, tell me about yourself, right? How did you end up in this job? What does your day look like? What delights you? What are some challenges that you're coming across? And obviously, you set up the interviews within a context of, we're creating, I don't know, a new health and safety program, and we want to get some input from all of you. So learning and training automatically comes up. One of the things that always comes up is I don't like my LMS. So, it's almost like a standard one. But anyway, so, you talk to a lot of people, and then you use data as well, HRIS data, LMS, LXP data, data you can find through Google Analytics from your intranet, Microsoft Teams, Slack, whatever you might have, to then really augment the information you found. And then when you create the personas, excuse me, you're actually creating a bit of a demographic profile for them. So I like to put a little picture on there, give them a name, a location, tenure, what their goals and aspirations are. And then I like to cover what they see every day, what they hear, what they do, what they think and feel, which is the most important part because that's that emotional connection. And if we can really answer the question, am I making a difference at work for them? That's really where we can create amazing learning experiences. And then out of those four buckets, I like to look at the pain points and the needs. But yeah, each persona looks, or each persona template is very different depending on the organization. But for me, those are kind of the standard building blocks that each persona needs to have. And yeah, once you have all the interview notes and the data, before AI, it took a long time to actually analyze this, but now with the help of AI, it's a little bit easier to look for trends and similarities and then create this fictitious persona based on real learners that you talk to.
Mhm. And at the beginning, that was really helpful, by the way. But you mentioned that you might speak to, say, 10 to 12 people per persona. But do you start by interviewing people and then work out what the personas are? Or do you have personas in mind and then try to reach out to people who might fit that bill? So Do you start open-minded or like with some people in mind already?
That's great. So usually I start with something in mind, which might shift. And so I like to think about it a little bit larger in terms of segmentation. And a segment might be sales versus service. So it's the job role. It could be geographic. It could be new versus more tenured people, right? So there's different ways, and that's usually how I go in. And then, yeah, sometimes I uncover, I'm like, oh, that kind of doesn't work, right? And then you have to adjust. But usually it's actually pretty aligned. And then, yeah, once you have the personas, it's really important that they don't settle, are in the corner and there's dust on them, virtual dust, because we're not using them, but that we actually tie them into our design and really think about how can I write for these people? What kind of assets do they need? What kind of content do they need? Right. So I've seen it more often than not that we create personas and we check a box and then we just go back to the way we've always done things. So
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. Thank you for talking that through. So let's imagine that we've done some work in a kind of learning context. We've got some personas pinned down. We have a sense, maybe particularly from the thoughts and feelings of what might motivate them, right? So what comes next? So from what might marketing do that learning again can learn from for how you're going to shift those people. You want them to, that they're starting at A, they might have different starting points, but you need to get them to Z. How do you do that? Like, what does a marketing person do next?
yeah, that's where those journeys come in, right? Or campaigns. And it's the terms are used slightly different in marketing and learning, but the way Mike and I talk about it is that the learner journey is more like that overarching journey. So let's say, we have a sales consultant and they need to sell a kitchen. So what are all the steps that they have to go through? So there's lead management. Then there would be, presenting a kitchen. There would be negotiations when someone is ready, like all these different steps. And the way I like to work is that I do workshops with ideally learners if I can get them, or minimum business leaders and stakeholders to talk through what are those steps, what are those touch points that everyone has to go through. And then I use a bit of a design thinking approach to actually talk about or create problem statements and how might we questions. And that's where the persona comes in, because we look at challenges that this particular persona has. So how might we help Josh to get over this hurdle of, not taking good notes in the CRM? I don't know, just making this up as a how might we question. And then we can solve together by answering that question. It's like, here are some ways of how we could do that. And that's, yeah, how you tie into personas.
That's great. Thank you. That's really great. What about the emotional side, right? So, you said you were really focused at the beginning of trying to capture the thoughts and feelings. I know that's always really important to marketeers. Um, but like, why should L&D tap into emotions, and what are they really going to do with that, right? So, what might you find out, and then what might you do with that anyway in your designs?
Yeah, so kind of in those same workshops, once we have the solutions there, I
Mm.
then actually asked that question. So how do you think Josh feels about that? Right? So once we have an asset or made a decision on something, so how do you think? And then we go back and look at the persona and say, oh, well, he's probably, a little worried about this because he hasn't been doing a good job in the past. So what can we do to help him feel a little bit calmer around this? And this could be how we position the training, how we promote the training to him, how we, yeah, the tone and voice of the training, right? To give him more examples versus less examples, So it really comes from the program level to the asset level, right?
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And earlier on, you mentioned, I think it was Mike who talked about the need for engaging copy, and how marketeers take a different approach to visuals and media. So if we're whittling this down, right? So we're kind of taking weeks worth of work and boiling it down to 5 minutes. But if you've got your personas, you have your learning journey, maybe hopefully your campaign mapped out, and you have a sense of emotions. What can you then bring into the details? When you come to actually creating the content, what do you think that gap is between marketing and L&D, and what again can a designer borrow from a marketing mindset?
Well, I think kind of like we mentioned earlier, marketers understand that it's that emotional piece that makes people act. So just moving beyond sharing information uh, which, understanding the data that you get and the knowledge that you get from your personas enables you to use real stories. So create situations where learners can see themselves in it. Build scenarios that trigger emotions, the same ones that they're going to feel on the job. So, for example, we've all taken the dry, boring compliance course, and as soon as you're done, it's out of you've forgotten it. Whereas if you can use things like stories that are realistic, and you're telling a story about how that compliance saved a real person in a real scenario that people can identify with, that's the sort of stuff that will stick with you.
Mm.
And sort of we kind of use this model. There's sort of some basic things that you can do when you get to building content. So for example, keeping things simple, making it useful, obviously, and then emotionally resonant. Those are like three, sort of ABC blocks of when you start to think about content, how you're going to approach it. And all of those things are informed by, what you've just learned in your persona work.
Mm. Would you
And
say
Mike,
some of that ties in, sorry, Bianca, also to like the kind of what's in it for me factor, that kind of
Yes,
um,
exactly.
which is something, it could be a brain thing or it could be an emotion thing, if you want to separate the two. But either way, right, you're going to have to know why you're there, but hopefully with a feeling that goes with it. So is it going to de-stress me? Is it going to make me a hero? Something
And there's
that's
and
not.
there's a handful of things that we're wired to pay attention to. So, is it personal? Is it relevant to me? That's one. Is it concrete versus abstract? That's another one. Is it tangible? Is it emotional? Is it visual? So there's like six key things that you can use either alone or in combination that are sort of hardwired things that trigger our attention. And if you use those, you're probably going to come up with some compelling content that's going to resonate and get people's attention and have them lean in a bit.
Fabulous. Thanks.
I just
Bianca, I cut you
want
off. So yeah, go for
Yeah,
it.
no worries at all. Mike's favorite example to really showcase this is a advertisement or commercial from Subaru, and then I let Mike tell the story because he does it so well.
Yeah, so it's a great example of sort of typical L&D versus marketing. So I think a lot of times those of us in the training world, we default to facts and figures. So for example, if I'm Subaru and I'm trying to persuade people that our cars are safe, a typical training team might come up with a whole stack of charts and reports and data and facts and figures. And as we've been talking about, that's not really what persuades people. And there's an amazing Subaru commercial. It shows a car that's just been completely totaled and smashed on the highway. And the tow truck comes to pick it up. The policeman says they lived. And then they take the truck to the junkyard. There's another pass off there, and the guy says they lived. And then at the end of the commercial, the family comes out, and the father says, "We lived thanks to our Subaru."
Hmm.
And just talk about impactful. It's like really two words, but wow, that's pretty memorable.
Yeah. And massively tapping, well, there's all sorts of emotions, but one of the big ones is fear, right? Yeah, especially if you're going for the family, the kind of heartstrings there of whole family in a car and stuff. Yeah,
Yeah,
okay. That's a
yeah,
great example to
exactly.
bring in. Yeah. So I'm going to take us from emotions, which is something we could carry on talking about, into the world of data again. So we've touched on it a little bit about one of that being one of the biggest differences between um, marketing techniques and L&D techniques is that naturally marketing will always look for data and analytics. And we talked about it a bit at the beginning. But if the goal is for L&D to drive more impact, then what could a marketing mindset kind of help them with there? Like what kind of data would you suggest they try and use, and where could they maybe find that?
I think the biggest piece is to think beyond the LMS data that you have, because often we look at smile sheets. Did you like it? Right? We look at seat time, which doesn't tell us anything because we all know by now learners have figured out how to hit that next button and to make sure
Yeah.
they can just skip ahead or whatnot, and it still looks like it's completed. And so yeah, go beyond those traditional L&D measures. And as I mentioned earlier, when you start designing a learner experience, make sure you tie it back to those overall business goals. So a goal could be we want to increase sales year over year. And I know that might not sound like an L&D goal, but it really should be, right?
Mhm.
And then obviously we have our learning and performance objectives that kind of feed into that. But yeah, where you can get data, I do still mention the LMS and the LXP because there's some good information in there that we should definitely pull out. But yeah, Google Analytics, if you have access to it, any information you can pull from your intranet, there's so much good stuff in there. Like, what's a common search term, for example, that everyone is looking for, right? That tells you a story. Um, you can use Microsoft Teams or Slack. You know, they usually have some data points behind it. Any learning solutions you implement that are tech-based, you know, we see a lot of AI role playing and coaching tools right now. They're full of data.
Mm.
So learning from marketing is taking all that data and putting it into like one output. And, you know, a BI dashboard, for example, could help with that to tie in different data sources. And then you have one output that shows you everything in one view.
Amazing, thanks. That's really helpful to have those ideas. I wanted to pull us back to the sort of start of the, I think actually probably the start of the podcast would be to start talking about awareness and raising awareness, which is something that marketing are really good at doing. And thinking about, you were talking about that kind of indicative data, where you can see that people are starting to engage, then that's a good sign, but it's not your endpoint. Hopefully, then go on to do more, right? But marketing's great at kind of developing, if you like, awareness, and they do that in different ways, don't they? Sometimes it's called like comms, but it's not really, it's more than that. But what could you think that L&D could borrow from that marketing mindset to help, if you like, drive the traffic to the programs that they've made?
Yeah. So like, building great learning is just half the battle. So like you're saying, we have to market it too. And so, going back to, where are those people already at and where are they already having conversations and tapping into that?
Mm.
Um, the best learning in the world is not going to do any good if people don't know about it or if they don't see why it matters to them. So in a sense, we are actually selling learning. So if we think about it, and this is my view, is learning's the most valuable product that your company has, no matter what your company is. And so, we have to sell it so that people understand the value and then why it matters and how it impacts them. So 100%, we have to do that.
For me, it's also about creating anticipation. And so, a great marketing example is the Super Bowl. Everyone is already looking forward to those ads during the Super Bowl, right? And I mean, personally, I would just watch it for the ads, but that's just me. But what often people don't know is that marketers create whole campaigns around these Super Bowl ads. There's like a social media campaign that goes with it. And anyway, there is, marketers know everyone is going to pay attention. And those are the most valuable 30 seconds that a marketer could get. And so, as L&D professionals, what are our 30 seconds? Where can we get our learners when they're the most aware and excited about something? And then dive right in there.
And there's a
And
really
sometimes,
great point about integrating it with other things too, right? It's not a standalone. So if you're having other events and you can tie these things together,
yeah,
it's a synergy that everybody benefits from.
there's a kind of saying, isn't it, that goes around, and hopefully it's true, but marketers think that you need to see something or interact or experience something 7 times before it starts to stick. Now, whether that's true or not, there's something in there about the pin pricking, isn't there, along the way, whether you're yet conscious of it or not. But by the time you come to see that ad for the Super Bowl without maybe realizing it, you've probably seen those messages. So another way to put it is, once you're bored of talking about that point, usually that's at the point where people are starting to listen. So when you've
And
been hammering it, now we're not talking about like sending people out, multiple e-learning courses to hammer the point, right? This is around the edges with multi-channel, in some smart ways, right?
and if you think about it, right, turn it back to like learning science and the forgetting curve and stuff, right? Like those seven multiple, space learning, all that sort of stuff aligns with each other.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I'm all for, thinking outside the LMS box as well. So again, as we talk about the multi-model or channel in marketing, what most organizations have is some kind of a volunteer program where people can spend their time. Why not tie this into your training efforts? So especially
Mm.
if you think about a salesperson, interpersonal skills are extremely important for them. I mean, for most people, but sales probably specifically. So why not say, hey, you have 2 volunteer days a year and tie them into your training program and then bring those skills, those interpersonal skills back into your training program, right? So that's just where marketers are just, yeah, amazing and more like experiential design versus, we're just sitting down and consuming something, right? It's
Mhm.
rather active versus being passive, what we do most of the time in L&D.
Yeah, not just putting something out and hoping it sticks.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to turn our attention to a different kind of question, which is maybe a silly question, but that is the L&D bin question. So, what L&D practice do you think you would love to see put in the bin forever? Anyone want to take that one?
I have a one that obviously comes to mind. I think I mentioned it before, and it's just this jumping straight to content without understanding what people actually need. I mean, I've seen it too many times of teams
Mhm.
go off and they build 800 courses, but they never talk to anybody. And so they're 800 worthless courses. And we have this massive content libraries that nobody ever uses. And so I would say, skipping over important steps to jump to creating content should go in the bin.
Yeah, hallelujah to that.
Yeah, for me, it would be using seat time and completion rates as a measure of success in L&D. We need to be done with that.
Yeah, okay, let's take both of those and dump them in the bin and hope that everybody stops as a result.
I like it.
Um, if you could make a plea out there to L&D practitioners to just take one action today to start adopting a marketing mindset, what would you ask them to do?
This is my favorite. So I've thought about this and asked a lot of people this question. My favorite thing in a simple response is efficiency of messaging. So marketers can take these complex ideas and make them feel like very simple and compelling. And so that's my favorite, probably personal favorite tactic from marketing is their efficiency of messaging.
And yeah, kind of tied to that is, for me, I'm a big persona nerd. So it's really learner before content. So we can send the right content at the right time to the right people.
Amazing. Thank you both. So we're now less than a minute, but I feel like we've got through most of the questions. So is it
No, didn't
we
feel rushed either.
okay?
Yeah,
So if
yeah.
you're happy, I'm
Um,
happy.
you haven't mentioned your book, so that is I can mention it on your behalf, or you might want to just say something to say that if anyone wants to find out more, you can look it up in our book. So whether one of you wants to quickly say that.
Bianca can do that really quick.
So if you want to find out more about how we approach marketing and learning, we have a book coming out on May 27th. It's called Think Like a Marketer and Train Like an L&D Pro.
Fantastic. We'll put a link to that book in our write-up of the podcast, which is on elisthat.com.